Hello, everyone, and welcome to another class of Coursera YouTube Masterclass. It's one of the only few programs like this in all time, and there will be more programs like this. They started Coursera YouTube Masterclasses to the point that there's like 50 of us or something that are all doing Masterclass. Mine is doing well from the content being film studies, and everybody thinks that USC and Calarts and Harvard would have the best film, and they do. Like Harvard has the best comparative lit now. It always had the best film. We're working to get it a film school, or at least a film major, or at least a film minor. And the more we work on that, the more serious it gets with Harvard, who are taking special attention to each masterclass, as does the masterclass headquarters. And all in all, they maintain quality control and content control. And if there's something they see or hear that they have to delete out, then that's because they need to. And if they want to keep the lecture, it's nice for me to know that they kept the lecture, because then I can move on to the next class. Because you need so many classes recorded and kept on here always. In the masterclass logo, Dr. Aaron Sheley of the Arts, I'm Dr. Aaron Sheley. You find that in that category, it has all the classes recorded from the beginning of when we were recording class 3 years ago, 4 years ago, until now. And we do these weekly. We used to do them quicker. We had lots of breaks. This time we'll still have a long break. I mean, there's 2 classes left in the Orson Welles, Films of Orson Welles class. And this class has been kind of challenging for all of us because we all know similar stories about Orson Welles. And like a lot of the same fantasy, like tall tale legends, that it ended up being who he was as a person, and then his movies being these fantasy tall tale legends. It's just like one of those cases where his head went up in the clouds, and the clouds carried his camera up there, because we don't know where he gets the ideas, for instance, to do the tilting shots in Touch of Evil. And there's like a tilt shot in every scene. And we don't know how hard that would be to edit, because it's still eye-line match, but it's not top to bottom. It's side to side. And it's really our own minds putting together the filmogrammar of the modern era, that it's a more montage between people that are in different frames and in different angles, and then suddenly like something seems off. Especially you got to think to the movie viewgoers of 1958 who saw Touch of Evil and were like, I couldn't understand why everything was tilted. But if you look at The Third Man, which came out like years earlier, like I said it wrong last time, but it was like 7 years earlier, right? And or it was the final version, I guess, was more close to the Touch of Evil. And that there were spreads between Touch of Evil and Third Man. Yes, there were mixtures of those, and that's accurate. But I think Third Man did start, I didn't say last time, did start earlier, and Touch of Evil finished first. So that Third Man has all the canted angles in it that Orson Welles used is a little bit perturbing, because the Third Man didn't come out in America right away, and it was considered a British film, sort of, and kind of is because of Carol Reed being British. But that Orson Welles is working with his international curio, a la the Directors Guild, which always states, even back then, that there should be some kind of international interaction, which Orson Welles had already had with the French Impressionists when he was building his avant-garde films early in his career. And then if you think about how Touch of Evil has these breaks in it, these sort of breaks in the montage, you should see how Citizen Kane will do a long take to a series of montages. The montage of the news on the march is the most like obvious example of ramping shot to shot that's all propaganda, all news making. It's like a shot of Kane and then a shot of a huge crowd, and then automatically we think that huge crowd is connected with Kane, or Orson Welles as Kane. And again, he's being all these characters in his film for practicality, because he's seeing how he wants it made, and he's the only one he can explain to himself how to do the scene right. Not that he's saying that he's the great actor that should have taken over all of his films. He's really amping for the director title to say he's a better director than he is an actor. That's why he takes kind of like G-rated movies for his acting, and no one really knows, but he did have enough compassion for his acting that he put it to the top too. And so we can't like really just say he was humming around on his acting. Like neither was John Cassavetes. Like to support their directing, they were serious about their acting. I mean, they took sometimes Orson Welles, but what's ironic is their films. A lot of times that they directed, John Cassavetes and Orson Welles, both from the Houseman organization RKO, and they were both way better directors than they were actors. But that they were actors in their own film was not always by choice, is what I'm getting at. It was a lot of times because they couldn't just shape another character to be like that. And in Orson Welles' case, it was, and John Cassavetes, was getting pragmatic to cast yourself in the film you're in, if that's the improv direction that you've already built with the same cast, and then you're going on to this kind of like, in Orson Welles' case, this new kind of opulence each time where it's like the money is getting greater and the challenge is getting greater and Hollywood's coming down on you greater, and then we're headed to the blacklist, and Orson Welles stays afloat because he never really gets in the scene. He never really digs into the Hollywood scene too much, because even though he's big into Greta Garbo and interviews, and later in his career he'll do interviews with Peter Bogdanovich. We said that he is into him being in Hollywood, but the Hollywood scene of like partying and carrying on, he took care of that during the avant-garde stages by partying in France. He went to the Moulin Rouge. There you go. But he was so serious about making films that it's no wonder that his films became what they did, that survived all of the other ones being pushed out by clerical errors and things that just they couldn't abide by in the censorship, or that the film was too mangled by other censors that they couldn't repair it, or that the movie just stopped being made, or that the script fell out of balance, or that one thing went wrong. Because back then, they would annihilate a whole film if something went wrong that was an integral part of the film. Now there's ways to kind of fix it digitally, but that's not exactly what they use the digital for. Like I talked in my film special effects class, that you don't just use a digital swatch to like hold up a scene. Like what they're saying is they're getting other information from the other cameras that were in the area and seeing if they can tie it in with any master shots. That's how they're digitally recreating it. They're not using like AI to fill in any gaps or anything, because I bet if you used AI on this right here, and I'm not going to, but if you did, it would fill in gaps like in my room. Like you wouldn't see that anymore. And I know this is my room, and it's a little embarrassing because Masterclass has been taught from my room, but I have to, because I hurt my hip long ago, and so I'm kind of stranded here. But the main reason is because I have now that works with it, is that I have like a psychology practice in here. I learned a bunch of psychology in school, in graduate school, in undergraduate, got my psychology license. But the reason I'm bragging about it is because it comes from a film generated thing. It was Birth of a Nation shot by shot that seemed to need psychology, so I went for both sides of psychology, and nobody's right when everybody's wrong, right as the ending. And that's, anybody can figure that out, but to actually have to steep through all the material of the film to like psychoanalyze it is not an easy task, and is now blue ribboned on my essay, because I'm like, well, this isn't just the shot by shot. Now I can say the psychoanalysis is accurate, and I've looked it over several times. It looks good. I also wrote this book, American Practical Psychology. So now back to class. We have Orson Welles, who's interested in things like we are in academia, interested in film school, even in film school, starting to emerge with Griffith, and it's starting to emerge with Douglas Fairbanks, and they're opening USC. And Orson Welles was in the middle of his avant-garde movement when he saw the establishment of cinema basically become this like monolithic classicism, like it was monolithic in Metropolis or 2001: A Space Odyssey. Here's another time that, in a metaphorical way, Citizen Kane is monolithic, and that Citizen Kane is a whole film, but it's a bunch of different side fabrics tied together, even some shots that were considered from other films, even like stock footage you go back into the closet and look for that had nothing to do with the film originally, but you can kind of tie it in because it's like a piranha swimming at you or whatever. You know, you can use stock footage to make the audience think that the thing is there. Let me give you an example. So if I'm sitting here looking off here and all of a sudden you saw a skeleton walking toward me or something, but it would be from the other angle. And then there was a better shot of like a skeleton walking from an angle. Since you can't see that angle, we could put the skeleton as already walking towards me, like on another shot, and shoot back to me here and be like, whoa. You know, so now you have the whole story of how they make propaganda. They make one image over here in another box, and you here in this box, and then by the time you're reading this image, it's rolled to the next image, and you're comparing them automatically. I know it's a cheap shot by directors to use that. It wasn't really discovered until 1925 by the Soviet school, and we don't want to talk about that too much, but Orson Welles did love certain things about that school and European schools in general, and East European and West European, and I don't think he really got as far east as all that because of what was going on. But Rashomon was a film he could consider like why it was good, you know, and so but visiting countries is really what you got to look at, and you can tell he's been to Europe because there's Third Man, and Third Man is shot in Vienna, and so he took a road show. Now road shows are beginning to be famous, not Village Roadshow, the company, but road shows are like where they gather everything up together, they put them in one big production, and that production kind of steals everything, and then they take it to wherever they want. They fly it to Bengal, wherever they want to go film, you know, wherever Hollywood approves them to go film. And a lot of times there aren't anywhere to approve. Like Bridge on the River Kwai was finding the country of Ceylon, and like no one knows where that is, and like that they approved of it. They approved of Ceylon, but like that was a war-torn area. Just as many of the cast members got hit by like live ammo on some of those scenes, and they weren't trying to do that. David Lean was trying to steer them out of catastrophe. So a road show isn't always a true success. In Bridge of a River Kwai Effect, it is a true success and makes more people want to do those projects like Third Man. And probably in a way, it really geared projects like Third Man to making it through because of its own outre handling on dialogue and costume design and everything, where it's getting like Michael Palin, Emmerich Pressburger looking, but it's David Lean. And so you're like, you see these like stark British colors out in the Bridge on the River Kwai, but then when you look at the full amplified, upgraded version, it's like this beautiful horizon, you know. We're always thinking that film is the horizon with a Western or a war film because it's like we're looking over to somewhere else, you know. So we look up, shows us looking up, and then we're like, wow, you know, and then the next picture is the beach. So that's how you, and then to sell something with propaganda, you just put up a picture of whoever. It'd have to be a lot more handsome than me. And he'd be like brushing his teeth or something, you know? And like, then in the next shot, you just see the toothbrush and it's fine and everything. And then in the next scene, you see his teeth white. So now you've shown a utilitarian item that does its job in front of you a little, demonstrates how it does its job, and then demonstrates itself in how it did its job and how good at it did it do. And that is how we measure all products that we buy. I know that that's the system by which capitalism measures what the project is worth, including the industrial factorization, right, of these assembly lines that are putting these things together. But like, even in nice products that are like pricey, you know, it's still like put together legitimately almost always by a robot. That way, like, the oils off the human hands or the slight problems of the human hands can be adjusted with, and instead you have it built with a robot and filled with a robot, you know, like that's how you get your shampoo. You don't show that part you don't show that part in the propaganda or the commercial. And propaganda and commercials are different for two reasons. One, Orson Welles films are not really either. His are like these non-narrative, narrative, exploratory docu-drama, like all put into Shakespeare farce. And made big look like, and made big and long and full of crazy montages that are making fun of themselves. And I like the montages that self-parody because it's like that News on the March one. It's kind of funny in the way he's so bombastic at delivering that Kane is dead. But the point of all this is that, like, you can take these moments of Kane and plaster them in, and it's different than any other film. But a commercial film doesn't really exist on the entire, except for an infomercial, which is like only the commercial. But a commercial film, in terms of sell a studio, well, you got to be action packed. You got to have romance. You got to have bylines with third act structure. You've got to have classical filmmaking, to convey a story the most with a commercial film that's a commercial for the studio. The studio makes certain kinds of films, looks a certain way, and you just plug in your movie if it's the kind of movie your studio wants. And I'm not talking about this nowadays. I'm talking about how, like, film studios have always worked commercially. Then it represents that studio, even if it's nothing like the previous film from it, it still looks a little similar. The audio sounds a little similar, and it's the type of genre that the studio would have wanted, or would have wanted to ask for. And RKO was really being molded and bent everywhere it went because it didn't really cling on to a specific genre. It would be like musical Top Hat, and then like Citizen Kane, and way before, in the year of Top Hat, they had King Kong. I mean, those two films really abridged the romance and the giant spectacle of a monster horror film, and you kind of get that in Citizen Kane, some feelings of both of those things, and I feel that Kane discusses capitalism to such an extent that it's probably not a commercial film. It's more like an accountant's bio. It's like one of those sad stories of, like, we're going to show you what all he bought, and then we're going to show you how it all disappeared. But it all disappeared as he's dying, and that's only because he's putting it all into storage, or he already has. But either way, it kind of gives you the hint that maybe the sled was thrown away after he died, but then again, he said the name of the sled before he died, and you're going, what did he do? Hold on to it till it was time to go in the furnace? But he was already dead. This is not a miscue, but partially to make ambiguity very lugubrious at the end, because it's like, we don't know if, like, you really turn this film back on, he's not dead, he's back. Like, people don't really think the ending's good when he dies, right? Or at the beginning's good when he dies. But all that stuff in the middle, when he was alive and he was going, that's what we relate to phenomenologically and psychologically, what's going on when they're alive. When they're dead, it's kind of this parody of themselves, because it's like looking at, like, things we can't explain. Things we can't explain is why we already know he's dead, probably because they're going on a mission to find out every detail of his life, and the movie generates the visuals of what the detective that goes to look for him, his clues, finds out. And so the whole movie appeals to this sense of, like, what is he doing between the brackets? Like, how is he living his life? What leads up to this? And you only know that the second time through, because the first time through you see him die, and then you think it's just going to go on, or maybe he came back miraculously, but then at the end, when he dies the same way as the beginning, the first time you see it, you're totally, like, have closure now, sort of, over the whole thing. But you don't, because now you have a double image, one coming at you at the beginning, one coming at you at the end, and everything in between is told so out of sequence that you really can't believe what you just saw. But, like, it still comes in a style that is computable. Like, you can still in your brain, like, understand the architecture of a classic film, understand the architecture of the black and white use in Citizen Kane, which really Orson Welles liked black and white. Black and white, he told Peter Bogdanovich, was the way he could get it the most clear, the most focused, the most visual breathtaking. He said that some of the best photography he's ever seen, that's won the Pulitzer Prize and everything, has been black and white photography. And it's been in war footage and in magazines and Sometimes I know we think, well, black and white's cheaper. That's only when it's like a matte drawing or something, like on a book. Like, really, black and white, when it looks at its best, it's still glossy when you put it at its best, you know. And these were glossy movies back then, but not too glossy because the film frame is organic, you know, like the film that they make film out of is organic to an extent, or back in the day and even now, and it was like this celluloid, and you kind of get into this whole thing like, was it alive? You know, was the film alive? And I know that the reason I bring my DVDs up here and show you is because they come alive right before your eyes, and you're seeing them and you're thinking of things from them. But I didn't bring them today because we're on this subject now that class is coming to a close, and all we have next week is the final. And the final is going to last as long as it's going to last. Same with this particular class, because we have a few things to talk about, but I want to mention what the final is. So since this class is called the Film of Welles, or the Films of Orson Welles, we have to look at the themes and how the themes are not repetitious, but how they're similar to each other, even made in different studios. So all the themes to the Orson Welles films are very particular to Orson Welles, considering that the different styles were crossing to studios they didn't normally cross to. So what is the theme that he's holding through that makes it all similar? And then I'll give you an answer in a minute. And then what is the metaphor that's going through it? So the theme and the metaphor are kind of the same thing. So you could say the theme, the metaphor, and I would say style, but that's what we've been talking about in every other class. So the theme, the metaphor, and the structure. And that's kind of the same style, but the structure is a little different. Those three things are kind of the same thing. So you could say, well, what's similar between Magnificent Ambersons and Citizen Kane? And you should watch a couple of the movies so you can compare them for the paper. But Magnificent Ambersons and Citizen Kane, for instance, well, Magnificent Ambersons is built like this glory box. It's like this huge castle. It's like all of them are kind of like dark in this castle and like have a secret past, but they're really nice and they're really unaffordably rich, and you just like watch them like have these dinners at their house that are just like immaculate, you know. And then Citizen Kane's kind of like that too, except they both show the theme of not really avarice so much as the loss of power. The loss of power. Because really, avarice, I mean, they were doing Gold Diggers of 33. Nobody really cares if they lose their money in that, because they had the money at one time. So, greedy would be like, yeah, that's like saying the movie Greed really didn't mean anything. And the point is that, like, in Greed, they were greedy people, but they weren't saying that the whole world was greedy. It was just like a fashion of type of greed, not the greed that consumes us all. I know film buffs love to think that that's the ultimate definition of greed, but it really isn't. We don't really want to get into that. But it's a certain type of avarice we appreciate about him, right? Because that he's going to fold all the other newspapers and bring them up. But he's building like this monolith of a company right around time classical Hollywood's become this monolith of a company, and Orson Welles is building this monolith of a company, and then it starts to show him crash. But in the middle, it starts to show him crash, and that's funny because you see him dead over here. He's doing successful, kind of lonely, kind of unspirited, kind of quiet, and then he gets his job at the magazine that he wants. And so he's now got all the power in the world to do whatever. And then we see scene after scene in different years of him losing his power. And the first time he really loses his power is when he loses the sled, Rosebud, and has to go to the kids' school. So we're seeing the cork taken off there, but it doesn't splash out until he's getting racked on by his editor that his paper's not right because it doesn't condemn his wife's opera singing, and so that's the beginning of his power. There's a power shift where he just gives it up. He decides he'll go with the other lady. He'll be with the other lady that he's even cheating with in the film. And that's going to be the loss of all his power once it's found out. Or people will grapple onto it and they'll say, well, that's significant because that was significant because it stopped him from going on to be president. It stopped him from not living a life he didn't want. but now he's living a life he didn't want. He doesn't want. So really, and by the time it's the end, he's walking past those, those mirrors, and you see everything balanced out like endless mirror hallway, like we get in The Lady from Shanghai by Orson Welles. Those mirror images of someone walking by and their soul is hollow. Their soul is hollow because it looks like a big hole in the ground. If you look at it from the way we're looking at this straight across, if that was the ground, And I'm sorry, but all these shots are really, they're really good at doing that. But like they're really good at conveying like certain like anti-commercial, anti-propaganda messages. And propaganda again is where you're forcing the belief onto someone, like with as much power as you can. And so that's why some of them fall apart because we can see through them. But commercial is like you can have, you should have, you would want, but you got to bring some money to the store to get it. I mean, unless it's a lot of money, and then it's not really dealt with always as commercially. It could be commercial district if you're building a mall, but like the guy that's building it's into industry. I mean, like SimCity kind of messed us up on that notion, right? Let's get further to the point. If Orson Welles was like building these giant monoliths, these giant like Hitchcockian burdens of like coming hope of his own masculinity in crisis, Orson Welles' own masculinity in crisis, whatever resolve, if his ambiguity would ever resolve, if whether he's good or evil or beyond good or evil in all of his characters. In Mr. R. Cotton, he's so beyond good and evil that he even mentions beyond good and evil. And you're just sitting there and you're watching these movies about this guy who went to total highest height of power and then crumbled. That's why Touch of Evil is kind of interesting, because he's kind of a second-rate cop, Mr. Charlton Heston is, that ends up taking it down. He's kind of a crummy cop. He's not even the kind of cop that normally deals with drug and sex scandals that are going on in, not only that are going on in Mexico, going on in Cuba. This Touch of Evil thing is really sensitive because it's like they're on the border of a Mexican town that can like somehow flee over the seas to some kind of other port, and it's giving too much away about like where these immigrants come from. And like Charlton Heston, he does play an immigrant. We're not going to go into it, but the point is that like they search him all over this grid of Touch of Evil, and it's this slanty grid anyway of like this town. And what I think it's saying is this guy is up against who we're talking about, the villain, and the villain in this film is more important because really in the other movies by Orson Welles he's never really the villain, but in Touch of Evil the stranger he becomes a villain like right when he kills the guy, right? That can happen in all of them, but he is the villain through and through in Touch of Evil. Nothing ambiguous there, and maybe that's how he played it larger than life and sees this guy with power, only this time it's the antagonist. So we're all sitting there like the antagonist has all the power and almost doesn't lose it, and almost doesn't lose the power. So now back to the question. So thematically you'd say, well, I see the theme of these postulates of these great empires being built by these characters that are unstoppable Atlas Shrugged types, right? And then you get to this like social conscious era movies of the 40s, and then the film noir breaks in and everything starts to kind of deface the power. And that's how these movies travel from point to point. Now, the metaphorical issue is more visual. How do they represent the falling of the powerful? Well, in Magnificent Ambersons, it's how the car breaks down, even though it's a perfect car, and they didn't know that our vehicle, and they didn't know that it would be that vehicle being pushed in the snow. I mean, the characters in the film didn't know that. So they're noticing that it's broken and it can't go anywhere. And of course, they get a mechanic to fix it. You don't see it again later. But it's like this real huge idea that they've invested their entire life savings into building an automobile, and it goes like 5 feet and stops, and that's the whole demonstration. And yet they erupt with cheers, so that they don't really lose their power until they decide to sell their like blueprints for making vehicles. They sell those blueprints for one of their daughters to have a hand in marriage with this like sort of viceroy duke guy, and they're all imitating that they're sick. And I know we've gone over this, and I'm saying their power starts to slowly dwindle as the car breaks. And in Citizen Kane, again, the main turning point that really turns it is when his new wife joins in, and he gets hazed by that politician right after that, and that's when that guy's snagging his power. They're putting him up, they're constructing him up. To answer the third point, they construct him up to a pinnacle, and then they start deconstructing him. And deconstructing again is that psychology lesson of taking shot, and then the shot after, and associating the two, whether they're related or not. They prefer in psychology the shot here is positive, the shot here is negative, and then we kind of get this like neutralized concept from it. That's not exactly the whole thing about it. I mean, they did mathematical timings, and they did all these stretch of numbers to look at where the best film cut can fall, the film edit falls, and they tried all these things. And so Orson Welles found all the regular rules, and he only really followed them maybe in The Stranger a little bit, but even The Stranger has this weird film noir quality about it, He followed them not because he ended up in the film noir inventor with Hitchcock. And film noir invention is one of those things where it's like low-key light, chiaroscuro lighting, so you can't see anyone in the darkness, low shadows on everything, and like they're walking around an alleyway and the rain is dripping and it's in black and white, like you see on TCM. Film noir is praised on TCM, Turner Classic Movies, because they always have the rain to show the movies that were offbeat from regular Hollywood, and those are the most remembered movies in a lot of cases. Even like The Big Sleep, which is a Hollywood film noir, is remembered more than usual because it's Hemingway and it's Fitzgerald, and they're all putting in their tie and they're all trying to make this character look good, but it's all coming from the Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock paradigm of Rebecca and Citizen Kane, because this is where film noir really starts. And in Rebecca, it's an indoors, like Magnificent Ambersons, kind of like you see the tops of the buildings, you see the ceiling, inside there in both of those movies. And in Magnificent Ambersons, and they're both domestic melodramas, in that Magnificent Ambersons and Rebecca have similarities, but not so similarities. Also involves how one of the Magnificent Ambersons was dead all along, and they're sort of seeing this ghost routine in that, and you might even see her ghost if it was really her ghost or his imagination. And in Rebecca, you never see the ghost. The ghost is like the camera movement later, like The Exorcist, And so putting all these film noir pieces together out of those two movies makes sense, because they're naturally lit, they're darkly lit, they're purposely lit with like the light on the street is how they light it. They want a lot of darkness. They want a lot of contrast. They want a lot of gray areas, literally in the frame. They want a lot of, because in Rebecca even you get this black and white, like really Baroque sense, but it's all being taken down to film noir and really being constructed, because the whole house has to be emptied out to find the ghost that somehow proved itself to enough people that had gotten the paper, And in Magnificent Ambersons, you're not really sure. It's such a quick scene, and I don't know if it's edited out of any of the versions you have or what, but there's a version I've seen where he talks to one of his sisters, and it may have either been the ghost or her twin sister. Would think it's her twin sister, but anyway, it's Magnificent Ambersons is one of the quirkiest ones besides Mr. R. Cotton. And Lady from Shanghai definitely has eccentricities. You know what? All of them, that'd be one good place to write your final on, is how eccentric is the theme. And that might be just pointing out a couple of elements of each film, how eccentric the film is, proving that with metaphor or visuals, and not just thematically, but like constructively, where you prove it with visuals and how those visuals become other visuals. So it sounds like a hard final. And for Coursera note, that's what it's going to be. And I'm not going to really give it next time when I do lecture. I'm not done today, but I'll give you a short example of it and discuss with you how you can word your essay grader before we disconnect with this class, because there's more to the point of building an essay, where the thesis is the first sentence, and that's where you're trying to prove something, or you think you've already proved something, and then you prove it through the words, and then you show it somehow metaphorically as a proven thing, and then that's how to write an essay. And I mean, like, lots of us know how to write an essay by the time we get into college. But I know some of you are new to college, or like just taking this class and kind of picking up the credits for it because you can write a little bit. But Coursera has to grade eventually, not just by content, but by not necessarily grammar, but by rules of the essay. So the whole question has to be answered. You got to set up, the question has to be kind of set up, which it already is. You turn in your paperwork to them. You prove you've seen all the classes, and then you turn in the final. You'd be surprised. Not just the people that I've given credit to, but the people that have gotten credit from this class. They've built it up to the fact that they're going to show this, I mean, at other schools too. And Harvard is really, really working with me on, in a couple of years or in a couple more classes, that we'll have enough recorded of these classes to actually have a minor in film at Harvard. And I know these things are like kind of, they seem speculative, but academia has a way of taking the speculative and putting that into stone. It's kind of like how movies are. It's speculative how these movies are going to look, but when we see it from when it was created, it's still somewhat set in stone. So, we now reach the sort of oblivion of it all, and that's where do we go from here? What can we learn from, what did we pick up from this class? Was it anything except looking specifically at the films and not really even analyzing them, but just kind of naming the components in them and how the editing and cinematography worked? It was kind of like that. The films of Orson Welles' class didn't have much biography, not only because he had such an eccentric biography that went all over the place, but because he was always making movies. That's why he stayed out of trouble. I mean, I know we don't have enough movies on his list to prove that he was always making movies, but he always was. Now that there's 15 or 16, and we can go through them, there's Kane, there's Hearts of Age, Kane, Magnificent Ambersons, The Stranger, Lady from Shanghai, I think is next. That wasn't next. Third Man is not his film, but then you get to not the trial, but see, I don't have them all in order that I should. But you have Touch of Evil, The Trial, and then you have Undiscovered Journey, and then you have F for Fake, and I also missed Mr. Arkadin, and it seems like a couple of others. And there's always some to miss, because that's one of the hardest filmographies in your own mind to put together. So don't worry about that. You might doodle with that, or look on IMDb, as we did at all the uncredited movies he was directing versus the 15 or 16 that he actually directed. And I said Touch of Evil in there somewhere, I'm sure, but it's grady because some of the films were being made earlier and came out later, and some came out earlier and then were really released later, and that's how all of film is. Only with it being independent, the schedule's way more off than that. Like, the schedule's like, well, it's an independent film, so they're going to keep making it till they're done, and that was how they had to do an independent contract back then. And so he was still, disasters would happen, movies were taken away. So we look at the films of Orson Welles, the ones that worked out, and we can see this kind of world of surrealism, like at the beginning of The Trial, where it's like this surrealist cartoon, and it's about this like door, and if it opens and you keep following the open doors after it, then you'll eventually come to a locked door and have to stop. And that's an existentialist proverb of saying that, like, just because it's an open door to one place doesn't mean you'll make it out the door that's all the way. In fact, you don't even know if that's the door all the way. You can't make it all the way, whatever that even stations you as to your progress. So, and that was Alexia from Parker that did that animation, and this time it makes sense because the trial is surreal, so now he's in his modern phase where the antagonist or the anti-hero in Trial is the one who's larger than life and is bigger than everything, but in the trial, he has to try and beat it, and it still beats him. Now, Chimes at Midnight is one I left out, and I know I'm missing Hamlet, or Macbeth and Othello, but Chimes at Midnight's the one I want to talk about because it's also very surreal, but it's also very, like, Middle Ages. Like, the costume design, the design of the set is starting to look so enriched with, like, these big sets and, like, values of what it would have looked like in the Middle Ages according to experts at that time, and how this was just like the open era of Shakespeare in the late Middle Ages, and like that it's Shakespeare written in the Middle Ages, see, because Shakespeare wrote in the 1500s in the Middle Ages, or like a little before that, not much, but so now he's thinking Falstaff is this character that he can relate to out of Shakespeare, and he puts all the Falstaff clips in and puts the whole like parts of the plays that they were in around them. But then he builds the set just like that, and that there's this whole Alexander Nevsky quality about him walking out to battle, and them all his soldiers being in tableau. Tableau just means you're not moving, but something else could be moving, but like something that normally moves isn't moving. And it has stayed for quite a while and looks like a painting. It doesn't move so much. Although paintings do move, and that's just if you have whiskey before you go to the exhibit. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, I wouldn't recommend that to you guys unless you're 21. And in fact, I forget this is a college class, so if you're 18 and 19 and 20 and you're wanting alcohol tonight because of what I just said, you are out of luck, brother. But I think that's what's cool about Orson Welles is he kind of covers these taboo subjects. Like, he kind of makes fun of the mainstream by the way he satirizes everything. He satirizes politics and Citizen Kane and newspapers. He satirizes rich people, and their inventions and magnificent ambitions. He satirizes in Chimes at Midnight. It's a pure satire of the Falstaff character. He satirizes the normal pornographic sex scene or the normal regular sex scene in Unconditioned Love, satirizing it by sending it up over the top, saying, we're going to make ours so over the top that it'll actually seem like they're in love, and then we're all going to, like, close our eyes when it's over and be like, I'm glad that's over. They were really in love. Don't ever show me someone really in love, making love to anyone really in love. That's scary. And he's already pushing these agendas, and they're not agendas, they're like art agendas. They're not agendas that are like political, they're like art agendas. Like, how can we fix this? I know there's a sort of social aspect to his downfall, and there always is a social characteristic to his downfall. But how can we place these characters in these worlds like Touch of Evil without thinking of them a little bit as like, almost like it almost gets to the point where it's a Dick Tracy in Touch of Evil. But that it's so scanted, so skewed, so drumped over the top, and so looking down on itself, and dark. The whole movie Touch of Evil seems dark. It's all in a couple of nights, and then there's Mr. Arkadin, which kind of has the same kind of like pose shots of each character who are telling these long stories that are being flashed back to. And so to keep track of, and you're still getting this idea that he's satirizing in Mr. Arkadin, he's satirizing like a Howard Hughes type in that one. Because the guy crashes his plane, he doesn't know where he is, he can pay any type of money to go anywhere and do anything. And so you can sort of see this expression of satire or eccentricity being comical towards the issue that it brings forward, and how it brings the issue forward is almost arbitrary, considering the issue is always found in the script, and the script is always written ahead of time, usually always, but some scripts are finished during the making of the movie. More nowadays do they go back and forth. They take the original script and still change it. They did that back then, but that's why scripts had to be like so A+ money worth back in the day, because they had to make sense on paper so they could change it on film with a guy like Orson Welles and change it all around. But the issue that comes, and the theme may have come from the scripts, because it seems like Orson Welles is dealing with a different issue every time. Like, the issue could be sex, it could be politics, it could be power, it could be, like with the trial, it's like pure surreality, like why our life is surreal. And that is like, because we live now, we talk now, but tomorrow we die, or sometime we die. We're gonna yell Rosebud and fall down the stairs. I'm not trying to say that everyone needs to get in gear for their own death, but isn't it weird how like movies end with death sometimes? Not just like Citizen Kane, but even Wuthering Heights before that. They end with it, and it seems like that's what it's going to be to us when we die. It'll just be like a closed curtain, blank screen, and there you go. You know. And I mean, like, this is like a film lives and then a film disappears. Because a film can come back to life and play a second time. And so can a movie, and so can a digital art video, and all of that. So, what you really got to hope for is in the textual references to all these satiring, or to the homages, or to the metaphors that are written in these books by like Laura Mulvey, and they're on Wikipedia, the Orson Welles on Wikipedia we kind of looked at. And when you measure all that, you can kind of see where Orson Welles deviates from the classical Hollywood cinema to characterize the film noir, in terms of the film noir being a catch with catch all about like this is powerful, but the power is going to crumble and you'll only partially see it. And the film noir all comes to a head with Touch of Evil, and that's when the film noir becomes drastically canted. And I guess that when you're talking about these bodies of discourses, you have to look at what films didn't survive, discourses about what films didn't survive, what films that did survive, what films were reconstructed by archivists and put out for the first time like a release, like Touch of Evil was. And UCLA and Library of Congress renewed that one. They renew a lot of films that were never even seen because of some censorship mistake that like kept the film the way it was supposed to be, out of contact with the people. But if you look at like how there's similar criticism throughout the best of the criticism of Orson Welles, then you'll see kind of how there are these satires, there are these themes and montages of the loss of power and the gain of power, and how power kind of adjusts itself to almost not just the network like Fritz Lang would do, but like to the and that he's always the underlord, or that he's always the underlord, the overlord of all that's being made, like that Atlas Shrugged element. He's always the overlord of the element, just like the director that he is, but he's really a soft-speaking director and really easy to work with, right? They say, but that in his movies he looks like this power horse, and it's part of the icons of Hollywood to make it look like you're this stranded director and everything's falling apart, and the chaos of the movie's getting to you, and that's what his movies are about, because that's what making movies is about. And I don't think he's going to apologize at all at the catastrophes that happen in his film. And it's kind of like D.W. Griffith. It's that same old thing. The ending is a catastrophe. The whole movie is a catastrophe, but the ending is the 10, 20-minute long catastrophe that lasts the longest and is the biggest. And we're not saying that Orson Welles goes away from that, but he does kind of tread through traditional narrative to where that doesn't have to be in Act 3. It can be worse. It can be shown at the beginning and then at the end. And we have other examples of the films going out of sync with like time. But one that I'd like to cover before the class ends today is in an Unconquered Love. It's almost like done in real time, which could be even scarier. I don't want to get into that, but I kind of freaked everybody out getting creepy about that one. So let's skip it. But let's go on to say Touch of Evil for the last of it. And Mr. R. Cotton. You can compare two things. Touch of Evil is purely pessimistic, except for the protagonist, who's a little character, even though it's Charlton Heston. Now, Mr. R. Cotton is this Howard Hughes type, eccentric, doesn't care if other people die as long as he doesn't, And he's oblivious to the fact that he's even crashed on a desert island, and that, like, he meets people he already knew because he knows people all over the world. And so it has this sort of optimism, like everything's going to be all right for Mr. R. Cotton, even if he crashed his plane and died, because of what a great man he was, and what we all loved him, and how he was great, and like he just made a barely wrong turn and he'll be a celebrity forever. But like none of us know who he is now, because it was the name they put over Howard Hughes, and you can totally tell that's what they were doing. But in a way you can't. It's changed. It's like Kane and William Randolph Hearst. You can't tell that his surrogate character that he's acting in, performance-wise, with theatrical cues, with dramatic interpretation, these characters that are practically satires, not of Orson Welles, but of these either figureheads or metaphorical figureheads of the rise of power and the decline of power. And so it's been a good class. I really enjoyed this. This is good. I'm glad we got to talk about Orson Welles. It seemed like it went really long in the middle there, but now that it's over, it seems like we still have things to talk about. Really, we pretty much wrapped it all up on this angle. I mean, we have what we want out of this class to teach you about the films of Wells, because I'm sure one of the two or three things I talked about will grip onto you and will show you that these are all the admonitions and addendums and discourses of Orson Welles discussed kind of in this kind of quick way. It's digested. It's abridged. It has to take in some consideration that we could have talked about one film, the whole class, or not, but it's the films of Orson Welles, so I hope you liked it. And remember, when you first took this class, you were rising to power, but next week's the final, so it'll be a fall from power. No, I'm just kidding. Everybody have a good day. All right, talk to you later. Bye.